On January 24, 1989, at 7:06 a.m., a 42-year-old man was strapped into an electric chair at the Florida State Prison in the small town of Stark. A wet sponge was placed on his shaved head, and a black leather hood was pulled over his face. His last words, addressed to his lawyer and a pastor who had visited him the night before, were simple: "Give my love to my family and friends." At 7:16 a.m., 2,000 volts of electricity coursed through his body. Smoke billowed from under the hood, his fists clenched. In less than a minute, he was dead. Outside the prison, in an adjacent field, a crowd of more than 200 people had camped out all night, waiting for this moment. When the siren announced the death, they erupted in a celebration that seemed to belong to another century. Strangers embraced each other. Motorists honked their horns. Someone had brought a frying pan to fry a piece of bacon, a macabre echo of the slogan that had been appearing on t-shirts and banners for weeks: "Fry Bundy. Fry." Street vendors offered commemorative mugs, bumper stickers, and t-shirts. Some parents had brought their young children. It was, without exaggeration, a party. The man who had just died was named Theodore Robert Bundy. Ted Bundy to the world. He was handsome, he was intelligent, he was articulate and charismatic. He had studied psychology and law at prestigious universities. He had worked on political campaigns for promising Republican candidates. He had volunteered on a suicide prevention hotline in Seattle, answering calls from desperate people and helping them find reasons to live. A co-worker on that hotline described him as empathetic, understanding, and genuinely dedicated to saving lives. That co-worker was named Anne Rule, and years later, she would write the most famous book ever published about a serial killer, The Stranger Next to Me. The stranger in the title was Ted Bundy, the man with whom Anne Rule had spent countless nights answering calls for help without having the slightest idea who he really was. Because Ted Bundy wasn't what he seemed. Behind the perfect smile, the impeccable suit, and the polite manners, behind the university degrees and letters of recommendation from his professors, was a predator who had raped and murdered at least 30 young women in at least 7 states across the United States. 30 is the number he confessed to in the hours before his execution. The real number could be considerably higher. Some researchers, based on patterns of disappearances that coincide with Bundy's known movements, place the total number at over 100. This is his full story. The story of how a seemingly ordinary boy, born into a Vermont home for single mothers, became the most notorious serial killer in American history. A story of stolen identity, unrequited love, thwarted ambition, and a darkness that silently festered until it became impossible to contain. Get comfortable, dim the lights, and prepare yourself, because this story doesn't begin with a monster. It begins with a boy who never quite knew who he was. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unmarried Mothers in Burlington, Vermont. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was 22 years old, unmarried, and faced a decision that in 1940s, America could destroy a young woman's entire life: what to do with a child conceived out of wedlock. In those days, single mothers were treated with a mixture of pity and social contempt. Homes for unwed mothers, like the one that took in Louise in Vermont, existed precisely to hide these pregnancies from the public eye. Many babies born in these places were given up for adoption without their biological mothers ever meeting them. Louise made a different choice. She decided to keep her son. But to protect appearances, the Cowell family constructed a lie that would shape Ted's childhood in ways none of them could have foreseen. The boy was raised during his early years in the home of his maternal grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, in Philadelphia. He was told that his grandparents were his parents. He was told that his biological mother, Louise, was his older sister. Ted grew up believing this version of reality. He had no reason to doubt it. He was a child, and children accept as true what their families tell them. But the Cowell home was a tense and dysfunctional place. Samuel Cowell, the man Ted believed to be his father, has been described by multiple family sources as a violent, deeply racist man with an explosive temper and a penchant for cruelty. He verbally abused his wife. He beat the family dog until the animal hid trembling under the furniture. He terrorized the neighborhood when he was angry. On one occasion, according to several cousins, he threw one of his daughters down the stairs for being late for dinner. Louise, for her part, lived with the psychological burden of having been a single mother in a religious and conservative family. She was a kind woman, but emotionally distant, unable to give her son the undivided attention he needed. And Ted, the boy, absorbed all of this. The tension in the air, the occasional shouting, the heavy silences, the unspoken secrets that he, with a child's intuition for grasping unseen dynamics, felt clearly. The exact identity of his biological father was never definitively established. The original birth certificate listed an Air Force veteran named Lloyd Marshall as the father. But Louise Cowell claimed at different times in her life that the father was a sailor, a traveling salesman, or simply a man who disappeared shortly after learning of the pregnancy. Some sources, including members of the family itself, suggested a much darker possibility, that Ted might have been the product of incest, that Samuel Cowell, his supposed grandfather, was actually his biological father. This accusation was never conclusively proven or disproven, but the possibility hung over the family like a shadow for decades, and some biographers consider it one of the keys to understanding Ted's later pathologies. In 1950, when Ted was 4 years old, Louise decided to escape Philadelphia. She moved with her son to the other side of the country, to Tacoma, Washington, where relatives lived who offered to help her start a new life. A year later, she met a man at a dance organized by her church. His name was Johnny Culpepper Bundy. He was a cook who worked at the military hospital at Fort Lewis. He was a quiet, hard-working man with a gentle nature, without great ambitions or major problems. Louise and Johnny married in May 1951. Johnny formally adopted the boy, who went from being called Theodore Robert Cowell to Theodore Robert Bundy. Ted Bundy. Johnny did his best to be a father to Ted. He tried to bond with him. He took him fishing. He included him in his weekend woodworking projects. He spoke to him with patience and affection. But from a very early age, Ted emotionally rejected his stepfather. He considered him intellectually inferior, socially awkward, and economically insignificant. Years later, Bundy would describe Johnny with barely concealed disdain in his interviews, calling him unintellectual, simple, a man without ambition or inner depth. This sense of superiority that Ted felt toward his own family, the conviction of being someone exceptional trapped in an ordinary environment, would be a defining trait of his personality throughout his life. In Tacoma, Louise and Johnny had 4 children together: Linda, Glenn, Sandra, and Richard. Ted was, technically, the oldest of them all, but he never formed deep emotional bonds with his half-siblings. He was polite to them, fulfilled his family obligations when asked to help, but maintained an emotional distance that the other family members recognized without fully understanding. He was, in many ways, an observer within his own home. In elementary and high school, Ted Bundy was a competent, but not exceptional student. His grades were good, especially in reading and spelling, but never the best in his class. Teachers remembered him as a quiet, polite, well-mannered boy, but also as someone who had difficulty fitting in socially. He wasn't bullied, nor was he part of any popular group. He occupied that invisible space in between, where children survive without attracting anyone's attention. At home, Ted developed behaviors that, in retrospect, have been interpreted as early signs of something disturbing. His maternal aunt, Julia, would recount years later an incident that left an indelible impression on her. One afternoon, while she was napping, she awoke to find someone had surrounded her body with kitchen knives. The knives were arranged with the blades pointing toward her, forming a pattern that could not have been accidental. Beside the bed was her 3-year-old nephew, Ted, who was looking at her with a smile. When his aunt asked him what he had done and why, the boy simply smiled and didn't answer. It was the kind of anecdote a normal family would have forgotten or dismissed as a strange prank by a toddler. But in light of what was to come, that image, a 3-year-old boy surrounding his sleeping aunt with knives, became a chilling memory. In his teens, Ted's social problems intensified. He entered puberty with an increasingly acute sense of not belonging, of being separated from his peers by an invisible wall he couldn't break down. He had no close friends. He didn't date girls. He didn't participate in the sports or social activities that structured teenage life in 1960s America. While his classmates developed basic social interaction skills, Ted retreated into an increasingly dark inner world, dominated by fantasies he couldn't share with anyone. It was during these years that he discovered violent pornography. In his last interviews before his execution, Bundy attributed the origin of his murderous impulses to the consumption of pornographic material he found in dumpsters and neighborhood stores. He described how he started with mainstream magazines and gradually moved toward increasingly extreme, increasingly violent material, until fiction was no longer enough, and a curiosity about reality began to grow within him like a shadow. Many experts have questioned this explanation, considering it a self-exculpatory oversimplification by a man who, in his final hours, was trying to shift moral responsibility onto external factors. But what does seem clear is that something dark was developing in the mind of young Ted Bundy during those teenage years, something he learned to hide behind a mask of normality that he would refine with each passing year. During this time, he also began wandering the Tacoma neighborhoods at night, spying on women through their windows. He would later admit that these nightly walks, which lasted for several years, were an essential part of his psychological development during adolescence. It was compulsive voyeurism, a way of consuming women without the risk of actual contact. But it was also training. He learned how to move unseen. He learned which windows were lit and which weren't. He learned the neighborhood's routines. Without ever putting it that way, he was preparing for something. It was also during his teenage years that Ted discovered the truth about his birth. The exact account of how he found out varies depending on the source. In some versions, he stumbled across his original birth certificate while rummaging through a family file and saw that it didn't list any legitimate father. In other versions, a cousin revealed it to him during a childhood argument in a cruel attempt to hurt him. In any case, the discovery that the woman he believed to be his sister was actually his mother, and that the man he believed to be his father was his grandfather, was devastating. Ted felt betrayed, deceived, humiliated. The very foundation of his identity was a lie constructed by the people who were supposed to protect him. And that wound, that feeling of having been built on a falsehood, never fully healed. In 1965, Ted Bundy enrolled at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, and the following year, he transferred to the University of Washington in Seattle. It was there, on Seattle's urban campus, that the transformation took place that would define the rest of his life. At university, Bundy reinvented himself with a determination that surprised even those who knew him. The shy, socially awkward teenager almost completely disappeared, replaced by an articulate, ambitious, and charismatic young man. He studied psychology with remarkable intensity. He became involved in Republican Party politics. He volunteered on election campaigns. He began to dress well, to speak with a confidence that he projected onto others, to cultivate the image of a rising young professional. The transformation was so complete that people who knew him before and after university could hardly believe he was the same person. It was as if Ted had studied how successful human beings functioned and decided to imitate them piece by piece. He observed his most popular peers, borrowing their phrases, their gestures, their laughs. He read books on etiquette and social behavior. He practiced conversations in front of the mirror. He wasn't acting exactly. He was building a persona from scratch, using materials taken from the outside world, because his inner material, whatever it was, wasn't suitable for social use. It was at the University of Washington that Ted met the woman who would change his life forever. In public sources, she is known by the pseudonym Stephanie Brooks, although some researchers have revealed other details about her. She was exactly what Ted had always wanted: beautiful, sophisticated, from a wealthy California family, with the kind of natural confidence and social standing that Ted had envied throughout his adolescence. They began dating in late 1967, and for the first time in his life, Ted felt he belonged to the world that had always been denied him. The relationship lasted about a year and a half. Stephanie was intelligent and observant, and as time went on, she began to sense something unsettling about Ted. She couldn't quite put her finger on it. It was a feeling of emptiness beneath the charm, a subtle disconnect between what Ted said and what he seemed to truly feel. It seemed to her that Ted lacked a clear direction in life, that he talked a lot about ambitions but never acted upon them, that he was extraordinarily charming but emotionally unpredictable. In 1968, Stephanie ended the relationship. She graduated from the University of Washington and returned to California. She told Ted she didn't see a future with him, that she found him charming, but that it wasn't going anywhere. The breakup was devastating for Bundy, more devastating than his outward behavior suggested. Years later, researchers and psychologists would point out that many of his victims shared striking physical characteristics with Stephanie. Long, dark hair parted precisely in the middle, attractive and delicate features, and an overall upper-middle-class appearance. The pattern was too consistent to be mere coincidence. It's not possible to state with absolute certainty that Bundy was murdering symbolic substitutes for the woman who rejected him. But the pattern was so clear that many experts consider it one of the central psychological motivations for his crimes. After the breakup, Bundy sank into a prolonged depression. He dropped out of college for a while. He traveled the country doing odd jobs. He lived in Colorado, Philadelphia, and Arkansas. During this time, he made a decision that would further alter his understanding of himself. He visited the Burlington, Vermont, archives and definitively confirmed the details of his illegitimate birth. The family lie was no longer just a suspicion or a rumor. It was a documented fact. When Ted returned to Seattle in late 1969, he was a different man. Colder, more calculating, more determined. He re-enrolled at the University of Washington, this time changing his major to psychology. He earned his bachelor's degree in 1972. During these final years of his university education, he also built a local political career, working for the Washington State Republican Party. In 1972, he was actively involved in Governor Daniel J. Evans's campaign, helping to secure his re-election. His work was praised by the party organization. Politicians who worked with him enthusiastically recommended him. And during all this time, he also volunteered at a suicide prevention hotline in Seattle called the Seattle Crisis Clinic. There he worked alongside Ann Rule, an older woman, journalist, and former police officer who was in the process of writing a book. The book was going to be about an unknown serial killer who had begun terrorizing the Pacific Northwest in early 1974. Unexplained disappearances, bodies found weeks or months later in wooded areas, a pattern that investigators were only just beginning to recognize as the work of a single man. The man Ann Rule was pursuing in her investigation was the same man who sat next to her every night at the call center, softly taking the pleas of desperate people, helping them find reasons to live another day. It was Ted Bundy. Ann Rule wouldn't learn this until years later, and when she finally did, she would write one of the most chilling nonfiction books of the 20th century. But all that was just the surface. Beneath it, something entirely different was happening. It is impossible to determine with absolute certainty when Ted Bundy began killing. He himself gave contradictory accounts at different times over the years. Some of his confessions mentioned crimes dating back to his teenage years in Tacoma, including possible murders when he was 14 or 15 years old. Other accounts placed the beginning of his killings in the early 1970s when he lived in Seattle. What is known for certain is that between 1974 and 1978, Bundy carried out a campaign of violence that spanned at least 7 states and left a minimum of 30 women dead. His method was terrifyingly effective because it exploited something that American society in the 1970s took for granted without question: that a handsome, educated, and well-dressed man could not be dangerous. This assumption, so deeply ingrained in the culture of the time, provided Bundy with almost perfect cover. People opened doors for him because he seemed like the kind of man one would welcome. Bundy approached his victims in public places where young women moved with confidence: universities, shopping malls, public parks, state beaches, libraries. He used a variety of carefully rehearsed deceptions to gain their trust within the first few seconds of the encounter. Sometimes he would pretend to have a broken arm, wearing a perfectly convincing fake sling, and ask for help loading books, grocery bags, or a sailboat into his Volkswagen Beetle. Sometimes he would impersonate a police officer or a university campus security officer, displaying a fake badge he had made himself. Sometimes he would simply approach with his charming smile and engage in seemingly casual conversation. He was handsome. He was articulate. He seemed genuinely harmless. The women let their guard down because every aspect of his presentation told them they were safe. The trap snapped shut before they could even realize there was a trap. Once the victim was in a vulnerable position, near his car or in a secluded spot, Bundy would strike her with an iron bar or metal rod that he always kept hidden in the car. He would immobilize her with handcuffs. He would then drive her to a secondary location, usually a wooded area on the outskirts of the city. What followed was a horror that Bundy's later confessions would describe with a clinical detachment that disturbed even the most seasoned FBI investigators. His victims were almost exclusively young women, between the ages of 15 and 25, mostly college students, most with long, dark hair parted in the middle. The consistency of the victims' profiles was one of the first clues that led investigators to suspect they were dealing with a single serial killer operating across multiple states, something that in the 1970s was a relatively new concept in criminology. In January 1974, Bundy attacked what is officially considered his first known victim at the University of Washington in Seattle. An 18-year-old student named Karen Sparks was attacked while she slept in her basement apartment. Bundy entered through a door she had left unlocked and fractured her skull with a metal bar. He then sexually assaulted her with the end of the same bar. Karen Sparks miraculously survived, but with permanent brain damage. She lost some of her memory, some of her motor skills, and had to relearn how to speak and walk. She was never able to identify her attacker because she never saw him. A month later, on February 1st, 1974, Linda Ann Healy, another University of Washington student, disappeared from her apartment. Her bed was neatly made, but the sheets were stained with blood. Her pajamas and backpack were missing. Her body wasn't found until more than a year later. in a wooded area called Taylor Mountain, outside of Issaquah. Throughout 1974, disappearances accelerated with terrifying frequency. Donna Gail Manson, 19, vanished on her way to a concert in March. Susan Elaine Rancourt, 18, disappeared from the Central Washington University campus in April. Roberta Kathleen Parks, 22, disappeared from the Oregon State University campus in May. Brenda Carol Ball, 22, disappeared from a bar near Seattle in June. Georgian Hawkins, 18, disappeared from the Kappa Alpha Theta dormitory in June after leaving her boyfriend and crossing the street to return to her own residence, a journey of less than 100 meters that she never completed. One by one, young women vanished from the Pacific Northwest without a trace. The police were baffled. There was no clear geographic pattern. There were no witnesses. There was no useful forensic evidence. Only absences piling up in missing persons files. Only shattered families who didn't know if their daughters were alive or dead, clinging to hope for months before accepting the unthinkable. In July 1974, Bundy committed the most audacious and terrifying act of his early criminal career. In broad daylight, at Lake Sammamish State Park, a public park teeming with thousands of people enjoying the summer sun, he approached several women and asked for their help loading a sailboat into his car. His arm was in a sling. He was polite, charming, and seemingly harmless. Several women declined his request for various reasons. Something made them uncomfortable, though they couldn't quite put their finger on it. But two did not. Janice Ott, 23, a librarian, disappeared from the park around noon. Denise Naslund, 19, disappeared a few hours later that same day from the same park. Witnesses recalled seeing an attractive man with a sling who had introduced himself to several women as Ted. It was the first time a name had surfaced in connection with the disappearances. Seattle police distributed composite sketches and appeals for information. More than 200 people called to name acquaintances or suspects. Among the calls received by the police, several mentioned the name of a young man who worked in politics, drove a Volkswagen Beetle, and matched the description: Ted Bundy. But his name was lost in the volume of reports, never identified by investigators as a priority lead. It was simply another name on an endless list. Following the Lake Sammamish incident, Bundy moved to Salt Lake City, Utah, where he had enrolled in the University of Utah Law School. The move did not stop his murders. In fact, it intensified them. The killings continued almost immediately after his arrival in Utah, and the pattern was identical to the one he had established in Washington. Nancy Wilcox, 16, disappeared in October 1974. Melissa Smith, 17, daughter of the Midvale police chief, disappeared that same month, found dead 9 days later. Laura Amau, 17, disappeared on Halloween night, found nearly a month later in a canyon. Deborah Kent, 17, disappeared after a school event in November. The pattern was terrifyingly consistent. Young women disappearing under inexplicable circumstances, bodies found weeks or months later in mountainous areas, and a frustrated local police force battling a phantom that seemed to move with impunity across multiple jurisdictions. But Carol Duranch survived, and her survival would be the beginning of the end for Ted Bundy. In November 1974, Bundy approached her at a shopping center in Murray, Utah, posing as an undercover police officer. He showed her a badge. He told her that someone had tried to steal her car in the parking lot and that he needed her to accompany him to the station to verify her belongings and file charges. It was a complete lie, but Bundy's performance was so convincing that Carol went along with it without hesitation. They got into her Volkswagen Beetle. Once inside the car, instead of heading to the police station, Bundy drove in the opposite direction. Carol began to suspect something was amiss. Then, suddenly, Bundy pulled the car over to the side of the road, took out some handcuffs, and put one on her left wrist. What happened in the next few seconds was a desperate struggle. Carol, much smaller than Bundy, fought with a ferocity he hadn't anticipated. She managed to open the car door. She rolled onto the asphalt. She ran into traffic. A passing car stopped. An elderly couple picked her up and took her to the local police station, the handcuffs still dangling from her wrist. Carol Durant was the first person to have seen Ted Bundy's face, felt his hands, and lived to tell the tale. Her testimony, her detailed description of the man and his car, would prove crucial in the years to come in identifying the Northwest Killer. In August 1975, Ted Bundy's luck began to change for good. A Utah Highway Patrol officer named Bob Hayward was patrolling a residential neighborhood in Granger, a suburb of Salt Lake City, when he saw a Volkswagen Beetle speed away upon seeing his patrol car. Hayward found the behavior suspicious. He pursued the Beetle, pulled it over, and asked the driver to get out of the vehicle. The driver was a polite and cooperative young man who identified himself as Theodore Bundy, a law student at the University of Utah. When Hayward searched the car, he found something that chilled him to the bone, a complete kit that appeared to be specifically designed for kidnappings. Handcuffs, an iron bar, ropes, large garbage bags, a ski balaclava, an ice pick, women's pantyhose with eye holes cut out, fashioned into a makeshift mask. Bundy was arrested. During questioning, he denied everything with an almost unsettling calm. He explained the objects with disconcerting nonchalance. The handcuffs were a toy he'd found in a dumpster. The tire iron was for changing tires. The ropes were for a camping trip he was planning. The ski mask was for skiing, and the tights with holes he'd found by chance and intended to use to clean the car. He was convincing. He was articulate. He seemed genuinely confused and upset about being arrested. But the investigators didn't believe him. They connected him to the description provided by Carol Durant. They organized a lineup. Carol identified him without hesitation. And in February 1976, Bundy was formally charged with aggravated kidnapping and attempted murder. The trial was held in June 1976 in Salt Lake City. Carol Durant took the stand and recounted every moment of the attack in detail. Her testimony was devastating. Bundy was found guilty and sentenced to between 1 and 15 years in prison at the Utah State Penitentiary. For the first time in years, the man who had been killing women with impunity across the American West was behind bars. But the investigations into Bundy were just beginning. While serving his sentence in Utah, authorities in Colorado charged him with the murder of Karen Campbell, a pediatric nurse who had disappeared from a hotel in Aspen in January 1975. Her body was found a month later in a nearby mountainous area. The evidence directly linked Bundy to the crime. He was transferred to Colorado for trial in the spring of 1977. And then he did something no one had anticipated, something no prisoner accused of murder had ever done in the recent history of the state of Colorado. He escaped. On June 7, 1977, during a visit to the Pitkin County Courthouse Library in Aspen, Bundy, who was representing himself and therefore had privileged access to research materials, jumped out of a second-story window of the building while the guard assigned to watch him was momentarily distracted. He had deliberately slimmed down in the preceding weeks so he could fit through the narrow opening. He landed, twisted his ankle, and disappeared into the wooded mountains surrounding Aspen. The escape triggered a massive manhunt. Helicopters, sniffer dogs, and hundreds of officers combed the mountains. Bundy was on the run for 6 days, disoriented and starving in the woods, before being recaptured while driving a stolen car. He was returned to his cell in Aspen under heightened security. But Bundy's story wasn't over. On December 30th, 1977, he escaped for the second time. For months prior, he had been systematically enlarging a small hole in the ceiling of his cell, working at night while his cellmates slept, using a hacksaw blade he had smuggled in. He piled the debris under his bunk. When the hole was large enough, that December night, he squeezed through it, traversed the narrow gap between the cell ceiling and the building's roof, and emerged onto the street through a maintenance door the guards had left unattended. When the guards discovered his absence the next morning, Bundy had already taken a bus to Denver, a plane to Chicago, a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and another bus to Atlanta. From Atlanta, he took a bus to Tallahassee, Florida. He arrived on January 8, 1978. He checked into a boarding house near the Florida State University campus using a false name. And what he did in Florida in the following weeks was the worst of his entire criminal career. In the early morning hours of January 15, 1978, 7 days after arriving in Tallahassee, Ted Bundy broke into the Chi Omega dormitory at Florida State University. He entered through a back door that had been left unlocked. He was wearing a stocking over his face and carrying a makeshift wooden club. In the space of approximately 15 minutes, Bundy brutally attacked 4 women as they slept in their beds. Margaret Bowman, 21, was strangled and beaten to death. Lisa Levy, 20, was beaten, strangled, and sexually assaulted, dying from her injuries. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner survived with severe, life-altering injuries, broken jaws, skull fractures, knocked out teeth, and neurological damage. The attack on Chi Omega was qualitatively different from anything Bundy had done before. There was no seduction, no deception, none of the meticulous process of selection and approach that had characterized his previous crimes. It was a frenzied, uncontrolled, animalistic attack. Bundy stormed in like a force of nature and tore apart everything in his path. The investigators who processed the crime scene the next morning were deeply shaken by what they saw. One of them stated that in his 30-year career, he had never witnessed a comparable level of violence in such a brief attack. Just hours after the attack on Chi Omega, that same night, Bundy broke into another apartment a few blocks away and assaulted another student, Cheryl Thomas. She survived, but with permanent deafness in one ear and neurological damage that would affect her sense of balance for the rest of her life. She was never able to dance again, something that had been her passion. Bundy remained in Florida for 3 more weeks, living under false identities and committing petty thefts to survive. On February 9, 1978, he committed his last known crime, and in many ways, the most heinous of all. He kidnapped Kimberly Diane Leach, a 12-year-old girl from her middle school in Lake City, Florida. Kimberly had left her classroom to retrieve her purse, which she had forgotten elsewhere in the building. She never returned. Her body was found 2 months later in an abandoned shed near the Suwannee River, about 60 kilometers from the school. On February 15, 1978, nearly a month after the attack on Chi Omega, a Pensacola, Florida, police officer named David Lee pulled Bundy over while he was driving a stolen Volkswagen Beetle. Bundy struggled with the officer. He tried to grab his gun. He tried to run away. But Lee subdued him, handcuffed him, and took him to the police station. When Bundy realized it was all over, he uttered a phrase that would become famous in the case files. "I wish you had killed me." Ted Bundy had been captured for the last time. The Ted Bundy trials were an unprecedented media spectacle in American legal history. The trial for the Chi Omega murders, held in Miami in June and July of 1979, was the first murder trial in U.S. history to be televised nationally. Millions watched, night after night, as Ted Bundy, acting partly as his own lawyer, cross-examined witnesses, filed complex legal motions, and addressed the jury with the eloquence of a seasoned attorney. And that was perhaps the most disturbing part of the whole process. Bundy was genuinely brilliant in court. He was articulate, well-prepared, and able to debate sophisticated legal issues with the judges. Some lawyers present in the courtroom later commented that, had Bundy chosen to practice law instead of murder, he would have been an extraordinarily effective attorney. The contrast between his legal competence and the monstrosity of the crimes for which he was being tried created a cognitive dissonance that both fascinated and horrified the television audience. During the trial, Bundy cultivated a fan base of women who came to the courthouse every day just to see him. Young women sent him love letters. They proposed marriage. They told him they believed in his innocence and that they would wait for him. It was a phenomenon that baffled forensic psychologists. A man accused of torturing and murdering young women attracted the obsessive attention of other young women. The phenomenon was dubbed hybristophilia, and the Bundy case became one of the most frequently cited academic examples. But the evidence was overwhelming. The bite marks found on Lisa Levy's body matched Bundy's teeth with extraordinary forensic accuracy. It was one of the first times in American legal history that bite mark evidence had been used as central evidence in a murder trial. Witnesses placed him near the Chi Omega residence on the night of the attacks. Microscopic fibers from his clothing were found at the crime scene. On July 23, 1979, after approximately 7 hours of deliberation, the jury found him guilty of the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, and the assaults on Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner. He was sentenced to death in the electric chair. In a second trial in Orlando in 1980, Bundy was found guilty of the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. He received a second death sentence for this crime. During the Leach trial, one of the most surreal moments in American legal history occurred. Bundy called Carol Ann Boone to testify as a witness. She was a woman he had met years earlier in Washington state, and who had fallen deeply in love with him during the years of legal proceedings. Boone fervently believed in his innocence. She had moved to Florida to be near him and wrote him letters daily. Taking advantage of a peculiarity in Florida marriage law, which allows a declaration of marriage made under oath before a court officer to be legally binding, Bundy proposed to Boone during his own testimony as a defense witness, and she accepted. Ted Bundy legally married in the middle of his trial for the murder of a 12-year-old girl. Boone became pregnant during a subsequent conjugal visit in prison and gave birth to a daughter in 1982, whom she named Rose. Ted Bundy spent nearly a decade on death row at Florida State Prison, exhausting every possible legal appeal. During those years, he granted dozens of interviews to FBI investigators, journalists, forensic psychologists, and writers. His aim was twofold: to feed his enormous intellectual vanity by demonstrating his understanding of criminology, and to bargain for information about unsolved crimes in exchange for postponements of his execution. At first, Bundy denied everything. Then gradually he began to reveal information in a growing and desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. He offered details about unsolved crimes in exchange for more time. He led investigators to the locations where he had buried bodies that had never been found. He revealed details that only the killer could have known, thus linking himself to dozens of cases that had remained unsolved in police files for years. In total, he officially confessed to 30 murders in 7 states: Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, California, and Florida. But investigators who worked on the case unanimously believe the true number is significantly higher. There are unsolved disappearances in several states that coincide with Bundy's known dates and movements. Some conservative estimates place the total number of victims at around 50. Other estimates, based on a thorough analysis of Bundy's documented movements between 1961 and 1978, put it at over 100. The night before his execution, Bundy gave a final interview to evangelical pastor James Dobson, founder of the organization Focus on the Family. In it, Bundy blamed violent pornography for turning him into a killer. He said that consuming pornographic material during his adolescence had fueled increasingly dark fantasies, and that eventually those fantasies needed to be acted out. He said he hoped his story would serve as a warning to others. The interview was met with skepticism by most experts, who had studied Bundy for years. The FBI, which had conducted extensive interviews with him for its criminal profiling programs, noted that his explanation was inconsistent with his own earlier statements and that he was likely manipulating Dobson to garner public sympathy in his final hours. Dobson, for his part, accepted the explanation and used it for years as an argument in his campaign against pornography. That night, Bundy also spoke on the phone with his mother, Louise, who was still living in Tacoma. The exact words of the conversation have never been publicly revealed, but sources close to the family have confirmed that Louise told her son he would always be her precious boy and that she would never stop loving him. It was their last conversation. On the morning of January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair. Outside the prison, the crowd celebrated with an intensity that shocked international observers. European commentators in particular expressed astonishment at the scene. In Sweden, France, and Germany, news reports showed images of ordinary Americans celebrating the death of a human being as if it were a sporting event. Bundy's execution became a defining moment in the international debate on the death penalty in the United States. Carol Ann Boone had divorced Bundy 3 years before his execution, after he finally confessed to several of his crimes. She had disappeared from public life along with her daughter, Rose. She legally changed their names and moved to a location that has never been publicly disclosed. She did not attend the execution. She did not claim his body. Bundy's ashes were scattered in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, in an area near where he had left several of his bodies, thus fulfilling his last wish. Ted Bundy's legacy is complex and deeply disturbing, not because of what he did, but because of what he revealed about the society that allowed him to do it for so long. Bundy murdered for at least 4 years before his first capture, escaping from custody twice before finally being apprehended. During that time, he operated across multiple states, crossing jurisdictions with an ease that law enforcement was unable to counter. In the 1970s, police forces in different American states did not share information efficiently. There were no national databases of unsolved cases. There were no standardized criminal profiles. Each police department worked in near-complete isolation, investigating its own cases without knowing that the same man was killing identical women hundreds or thousands of miles away. The Bundy case was one of the catalysts that led to the creation of the FBI's Violent Crimes Reporting System, known as VICAP, and the renowned criminal profiling program at Quantico that the Bureau would develop in the 1980s. FBI agents who extensively interviewed Bundy during his incarceration used his statements to construct some of the first modern psychological profiles of serial killers. In a sense, Bundy forced U.S. law enforcement to modernize and acknowledge the existence of a type of criminal that until then had been mistakenly considered a rarity. But there is another dimension to Bundy's legacy that is more uncomfortable to confront. Bundy demonstrated that American society had, and perhaps still has, a massive blind spot when it comes to white, educated, and physically attractive men. His appearance, his social demeanor, his education provided him with cover that a less attractive man, a man of a different race, or a man from a lower social class likely would never have had. Investigators dismissed him as a suspect on more than one occasion because he simply didn't look like a killer. Witnesses doubted their own observations when they saw him near potential victims because he didn't fit their mental image of a predator. That deeply ingrained assumption, the idea that monsters have to look like monsters, cost the lives of an unknown number of women during the 4 years Bundy killed with impunity. The cultural impact of the case has been extraordinary and lasting. Dozens of books have been written about Bundy. Hundreds of hours of documentaries have been produced. Fictional films have dramatized his life time and again. His name has become synonymous with a specific type of predator, the killer who doesn't look like a killer, the smiling monster. The man you would open the door to without hesitation because his appearance conveys normalcy. Ted Bundy didn't invent serial murder, but he did demonstrate, in the most horrific way possible, that the most dangerous predators aren't the ones lurking in dark alleys, looking menacing. They're the ones who sit next to you in the university library, the ones who offer to help you in the parking lot when you're carrying your groceries, the ones who smile with a warmth that seems genuine because, in that precise moment, for them, it is. The smile is real. The warmth is real. What lies beneath the smile is what you can't see, and what you can't see is exactly what kills you. And that's what makes Ted Bundy's story, decades after his death, one of the most terrifying ever told. Not because it's the story of a monster, but because it's the story of a man who seemed like anything but a monster. A man who could have been your classmate, your office colleague, your neighbor, your sister's friend. A man you would have trusted with your car, your house, your children, because he seemed exactly the kind of man you could trust. And therein lies the true horror of the case. Not in the darkness of the crimes, but in the light of the face that committed them. Thank you for listening. If you are still awake, I hope this story has given you something to think about as you close your eyes. And if you've already fallen asleep, then this documentary has served its purpose perfectly. In any case, good night.